Good afternoon. My name's Tim Flagg, and I'd like to welcome you to this webinar with Arch Apprentices. My first question, just while we're getting going, is to check that you can all hear me okay. So obviously that's one of the most fundamental things about having a webinar, and I'm presuming you can all see me okay as well. So as I say, my name is Tim Flagg. I'm going to be the host for this afternoon's webinar. You'll see me looking at the computer screen down here just to check everything's working fine. So do forgive me if I'm not looking directly at you. I'm very excited to introduce you to our guests this afternoon. I'll be talking more about them in a moment. I just wanted to talk you through a couple of the main housekeeping points here as well. When you first got the link, that was a link to what we call the event page. If for whatever reason your connection drops out, please go back to that link, and you should be able to go back to the event and click on the window to launch the video again from there. So I don't think there would be problems, but that's what you do if it does cut out. Also, if you want to put comments, you can put comments on that event page as well, and we'll be looking at those as we progress. So today's webinar is Maximising Your Apprenticeship Levy. It's hosted by Arch Apprentices in association with techUK. And I'm joined by a panel of experts who will be sharing their perspectives and their insights on the Apprenticeship Levy. At the end of the webinar, we'll have a Q&A session to answer any questions that you might have, particularly about how the apprenticeship will be relevant and how it's going to affect your business. The entire webinar will last about an hour. Before I introduce the panel, just a couple of other points. We're obviously sharing our screen with you, but don't worry, we can't see you. So if you're there in your pajamas or something like that, that's fine. We've talked about what to do if your connection drops out already. When we get going, you'll see there is a Q&A box which appears on the right-hand side of the screen. It's not there now, I'll turn it on later. That Q&A box allows you to ask questions. When we come to the question and answer session at the very end of the webinar, we'd like to bring as many questions from you as possible to our expert panel here. So please do start thinking of questions you'd like to ask, note them down. You can also use the hashtag Apprentice Levy, that's hashtag Apprentice Levy, and make sure you tweet at Arch Apprentices as well. You can put questions that way as well. So whilst we're hoping that you are able to join us for the entirety of the webinar, we understand you might be called out on other things. So a recording of this webinar will be made available afterwards. Okay, so I am now going to introduce our first speaker. A quick word from our partners at techUK, Doniya Soni. Doniya, over to you. Quick word.
So I'm Doniya. I'm the Policy Manager for Skills, Talent and Diversity at techUK. Just to give you a bit of a background on what techUK is. techUK is the industry body representing the tech sector's voice in the UK. We've got about 900 members who employ over half of all tech sector roles in the UK, and we're continuing to grow. techUK represents the tech sector voice all the way from the innovative startups to the FTSE 100 global companies. And one thing that all our members have in common is a skill shortage. So this is an urgent policy problem facing the tech sector, in which there's a difficulty for tech sector to gain access to the talent they need to grow. Recent estimates from Parliament suggest that the UK will need 745,000 jobs between 2013 and 2017 that require digital skills. So there's plenty of jobs to go around, essentially. The Apprenticeship Levy is a key policy function of this government's commitment to increasing digital skills as well as all types of skills. The levy has presented itself to the tech sector, allowing there to be many opportunities as well as a number of challenges that we'll be discussing a bit later. The tech sector has been committed to boosting the number of apprentices in the last couple of years and continue to grow the number of apprentices and hiring the young and bright talent that the sector needs to thrive. techUK has been a critical friend to government in the development of this apprenticeship levy policy, but at this time we want to make sure that our members and the tech sector is as well equipped as possible to implement the policy, which is why we've teamed up with Arch Apprentices to demonstrate to members what the apprenticeship levy is, how you can use it to the best of your ability, and how you can use it to make it work for you. As we will discuss a bit later, not all details have been revealed yet on the levy, so watch this space. There's more to be coming, there's more to be discussed, and we'll continue to work with our members, our partners at Arch, and with government to make sure that the levy is fit for purpose for the tech sector.
Thanks very much, Doniya. Really interesting to hear that you describe your role as being a critical friend to the government, and I think that's really important that the government is able to engage with not just businesses but organisations that represent the various interests to come up with policies which are going to best reflect their needs. Great, well thank you for that. Let's move on now and hear from our first speaker, Ben Rowland. Ben is the co-founder and account director at Arch Apprentices. Ben co-founded Arch Apprentices with the Blenheim Chalcott Group in 2012, with the first apprentices beginning their apprenticeship the day after the London Olympics. Quite a memorable event as we come up to Rio. Since then, Arch has started over 1,000 people on apprenticeships, which is fantastic, working with employers such as Google, John Lewis, Barclays, plus many SMEs, charities and government bodies. Ben has over 15 years experience building organisations and initiatives that address social and economic challenges. And he began his career helping government organisations to understand the effectiveness of regeneration and labour market programmes. He then set up strategy consultancy RSE Consulting, advising local authorities on technology and change, which was acquired by the Tribal Group PLC in July 2008. So a lot of insight there that we're looking forward to getting from Ben. Let me just move on to share our screen a minute, and then I'll pass over to Ben. Great, so you should now be able to see the slides from Ben. Let's move over. Great.
Okay.
Thanks, Ben. Over to you.
Thanks very much indeed. So it's really nice to be with you today. We are hoping that what we're going to achieve is to help people who are perhaps less familiar with the levy than we are to get up to speed to understand what it's all about, and crucially, what practical steps they can take with their colleagues over the coming few months before the introduction of the levy. So the structure for our presentation is, I think we can skim down here, please. It's to give an overview of the apprenticeship levy, how to approach planning for the levy, and I'm going to ask my colleague, the Director of Learning and Development at Arch, John Pritchard, here to take us through that bit. And then we've been out and about talking to lots of employers and finding lots of questions that come up time and again. So we thought we'd take some of those individually and see if we can answer some of those questions. Of course, if they're not the questions that you've got, as Tim was saying, please do use the box to send your emails in, and we have a team with us who will make sure that we get those questions, and hopefully we can get to answer those as well. So that's the structure for today. What I wanted to do is just quickly introduce you to Arch. So as Tim was saying, we've worked with a whole bunch of different employers. Obviously, the ones we've put on this slide are the ones that you've probably heard of or have a better chance of having heard of. But of course, we've worked with lots of people who you haven't heard of or haven't heard of yet, fast growth startups, as well as more established businesses, charities and government bodies, as Tim was saying. I think for those of you, we like this picture. We think it's really important for those of you who haven't had experience of taking on apprentices in the past and are sort of wondering what an apprentice looks like. Well, this picture hopefully conveys a really clear impression of what that is, a really diverse group of bright, enthusiastic, eager to learn young people who are coming to organisations committed to getting on with the tasks that are required to help make their employer more productive, more successful, but who are also committed to learning as well. And when we get to our graduations, there is a real celebration of their learning and what they've achieved through the apprenticeship, as much as having got their career underway successfully with the employer they've been with. So for those, I think lots of people who are approaching the levy, it feels often that it's a burden. It's clearly an extra financial burden, but also a burden in terms of organising it. But we would really encourage, we'd share with you our experience of helping companies take on apprentices, which is actually a really exciting thing, a really great way of getting fresh young talent into the business. And so can be looked at as an opportunity as well as the burden that it's sometimes seen as. So I think it's worth just saying why we understand the government is bringing the apprenticeship levy in. It's a helpful context. They have observed that there is, that UK businesses often complain, quite rightly, as Doniya was saying, those figures are pretty powerful, that there aren't enough skills for our individual organisations and therefore us collectively as an economy to grow and to thrive. But at the same time, if you compare how much British companies typically spend on training versus companies in some of our OECD peers, I mean, the numbers aren't perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but it does appear to be the case that we spend less, quite a fair bit less than our OECD competitors on training. So the government wants to address that. And one of the complaints always by British companies has been, well, why should we train up people if actually our competitors, who by the way have saved a whole ton of money not training people, are then going to just pinch them from us? So the government is keen to level that playing field and is essentially saying to all large employers defined as having a payroll of £3 million a year or above, is saying, well, you're all going to invest in apprenticeships. It's just up to you whether they're apprenticeships in your business or someone else's. So that's where the levy is kind of coming from. If I can go on to the next slide, Tim, just to really be clear about what it is, because we are still detecting, despite the government having been talking about this for the last year or so, I guess, that there's still some misunderstanding about what actually it is. So I think the one thing that people know is that it's currently due to start in April 2017. It's 0.5% of payroll above £3 million. So if your annual payroll is £3 million or above, then it's 0.5% of that. The money is deducted with your PAYE and goes into an account with the Digital Apprenticeship Service, which is a new government website, essentially stored in an account with, for that particular employer. That employer can then use that money, those funds, to spend on approved apprenticeship training. And by approved, they mean on an approved apprenticeship program. So you can't just make anything up and say, oh, it's an apprenticeship. It has to be something that's gone through a mechanism that's overseen by government. And secondly, with an approved apprenticeship training provider. So you can't just create a team internally and say they're our training provider and ready to go. So there are some stipulations about the program that you use and who you get to deliver that for you. I think it's really important to state that the levy funds can be used not just for new hires, not just the kind of young people who I showed you a picture of a moment or two ago, but it can be used for existing employees. And in fact, quite a few of our apprentices have been existing employees that the employer said, actually, I want them to go through a structured program to help them develop and progress. And certainly that's true for the levy. One of the things we're waiting for in the announcement that Doniya was referring to is confirmation that people who already have a degree can have their apprenticeship program funded through the apprenticeship levy. We are as certain as we can be on these things that is going to be the case. We're just waiting final confirmation of that. But that really radically shifts how companies can look at apprenticeships as structured training programs for everyone in their organisation to enrich, professionalise and accelerate their learning and their careers. So I think that's really important. Another thing we're waiting on confirmation for tomorrow is how quickly you have to use these funds. So the mechanism is going to be a digital voucher. So you, let's say, pay £10,000 in month one of your apprenticeship levy. Let's say that's 0.5% of your payroll above 3 million. That will be stored in the form of electronic vouchers, and each voucher will have an expiry date on it, a kind of a use it or lose it system. At the moment, the government's been talking about that being an 18-month use it or lose it. So the money that you pay in April 2017, for example, if that was £10,000, would have to be spent on approved apprenticeship training by October 2018. So that's the current kind of understanding. I suspect we may see some change in that expiry date when the announcement comes out to extend it, to lengthen it. For those of you who are near a border or have operations in Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales, as well as England, because this is a levy that can be spent on training in England, it does get a bit more complicated. And again, we're waiting for the final detail, but they are talking about taking a proportion of your levy pot in proportion to the number of employees who are based in or who live in one of those devolved authority regions, and transferring the money directly into the skills budget of those organisations, which is different from the one that applies in England. For many of you, obviously that won't make a difference, but for some of you, it will, and therefore, unfortunately for you, as well as lobbying the Westminster government, the Whitehall government on this, which is the English bit, you'll also have to be lobbying the skills agencies in Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales as well. So that's the levy. Please do ask questions if you've got them on what actually it is intended to be. So that's the introduction to the levy. I'd like to introduce you to, are you going to do the introduction?
I was going to quickly just do that,
to John, Director of Learning and Development Arch. So Tim, over to you for the intro.
Great. Well, thanks very much for that, Ben. Just before we move on to John, I just had one follow-up question I wanted to ask you. We've been talking about the apprenticeship levy, and obviously we've been planning for it coming in April 2017. Are you starting to see more of the companies, the employers that you're working with now, take an interest and start to put in place the plans, or are people still a little bit in the dark about what it means yet?
So it varies hugely, I would say. I mean, Don, it might be interesting to get your view on this across the tech sector. I mean, go on.
Yeah, so we've estimated that at techUK members, we've got 900 members, and we estimate that between a third and a quarter will be affected by the levy, based on techUK member engagement in the development of the levy. We are under the impression that a large number of employers aren't yet aware that they will even be hit by the levy, which is a real communication issue. Because we've been doing a lot of communication with our members, but unless now the Department for Education issues out a statement to the organisation saying, in April 2017, you will be levied on your payroll, there's a fear that companies won't have time to implement a strategy before then.
Yeah. And then some of the employers we're talking to are quite advanced, actually.
Yeah.
And it varies significantly between them. I mean, for people who are watching who haven't yet started the process, I would say there's kind of a don't panic.
Yeah, it's not too late.
It's definitely not too late. It doesn't take, in our experience of this is actually, in terms of planning for this, anything between 3 and 6 months is a good enough run-in time to get yourself together.
It's more the awareness aspect that we're the most concerned about. It's just that we would like tech companies to understand that this is happening and what are the best steps you can take, which is why we actively involve ourselves in webinars such as this one to get our members more aware of the situation.
Brilliant, thank you. So now I would like to introduce John. John Pritchard is the Director of Learning and Development at Arch Apprentices. And after serving 23 years in the military, John left to establish Smart Computing, a training provider working with Cambridge Regional College to deliver the IT professional qualifications and apprenticeships. During that time, he ran national pilots for the introduction of the new user and technical apprenticeships and was involved in designing new qualifications for the sector. John has also been awarded the City and Guilds Gold Medal of Excellence for Apprenticeship Delivery and is a life member of City and Guilds for contributions to education. John worked actively with employers to design the new Trailblazer apprenticeship standards for the tech partnerships, ensuring employers, providers and awarding organisations' requirements are aligned to government requirements and regulations, enhancing the learner's experience, qualifications and competencies when beginning their IT careers. So a lot of experience there, which I know we're going to be drawing upon, particularly on the standards and frameworks there. With pleasure to hand over to John now.
Thanks, Tim. So I think following on from what Ben has said, there's probably a process that everybody's going to go through and stick to asking all of their questions. And as the slides indicate, the first thing is how much is your levy bill? And as Ben has already mentioned, it's anything that's over £3 million. But I think where the main points for people to take note of that is that it is a monthly payment, and your bill, your PAYE bill, could rise and fall as you go through that period of time. And therefore that could fluctuate. So in some cases where we're working with larger companies who have large consultants on at peak periods of the time, that will raise their bill at that period of time, and it could go back down. So there's a whole movement in that. It's not just one lump sum and it's taken in one go. It is taken on a monthly basis. And it is, at this stage, I think you should be looking at what is a rough estimate of your bill per month. And from that, you can then calculate what you can spend that on. From there, it's probably then what and how much do you want to use during that period. And as Ben mentioned again, so somebody who starts in the April period, you've got 18 months. that gives you 18 months to start that person. It doesn't mean that you have to put all those people on at the very beginning and panic to spend that money. Is the right opportunity there? Is the right time for those people to do the training? And all that can be taken into consideration, but you can bank that money knowing that it is there and that you can spend that on, as Ben has mentioned, it has to be an approved standard. But even if that standard doesn't exist, and I'll explain a bit more, it might give you leading time to have something designed, or you know that something's being developed currently that will be out in 6 months' time. You could start them and start planning to use that in 6 months. It doesn't have to be spent at the very beginning. So from there, it's looking at those skills. So what are the current skills? And I think there's a couple of categories, really. It's what current training do you already use and invest your money on learning development, and can that learning be taken and put into an apprenticeship? Do you have people who are currently on an apprenticeship? They might have started off on a level 2, level 3, and you need to progress them. Or what are the skills gaps that are in your organisation, and can we fill them with something that you're not familiar with in a current apprenticeship, or does something, as we said earlier, need to be designed or developed for you to meet that skills gap? And I think looking at that leading time, and as Ben said, we 3 to 6 months, we're working with companies already, but there's still plenty of time to look at that skills that you look at. Technology changes daily, as we all know. We don't know what's coming around the corner. There is no need to panic about those skills gaps that you might see. There is still time to develop something, and it doesn't take 18 months to get a standard developed and to fruition, that you could bank that money to spend it. So there is no need to panic over that. It's really sitting down and being realistic about what your training needs are, what those skills gaps currently are, what you might see those skills gaps in the future, and how we can fit that to the best and maximise the voucher or the levy that you've got. I think from there, it's once you've identified that training, who are you currently working with? If you're doing that training, can they deliver the apprenticeships for you? Who's out there that can do that training? And again, who's registered with the SFA or with government to allow you to draw or use your voucher? And if not, how can you probably split some of that training? If someone is in a digital sector, and I'll give you an example where we might use a data analytics in finance, but you still want some finance training. One provider might not be able to do that. And how is that going to work in collaboration to meet all of those skills gaps that you need? So there's the planning continues, and it's making sure that those standards map to that training that you have. More importantly, I think, this is led by you as the employer, not by us as the training provider. You know what your skills gaps are. It's not for us to say you need to do this. You should be coming to us with a proper job, a job role that exists, and we should be able to try and help you map that with current training to fit to the standard. If we talk about headcount, and I think it's really critical. Ben was referring to taking someone in as a new apprenticeship. Not everybody's going to have the capacity to increase your headcount, and therefore, what progression is there within your employment? Now, there are a lot of companies who are already approaching us saying, well, we need to spend our levy and we need to put more on the highest band, and we want to spend £27,000, as we were talking earlier about, to use the voucher up. If you do that all in year 1 or year 2 and you spend that levy within your 18 months, this levy is going to continue. So what do you invest it in the next time? It's thinking about progression routes within your organisation and those skills gaps that you can continually use that money and continually fill those skills gaps. And as we said, technology is changing so much that you might start someone on, I'll say web development, but software development, data analytics. That job role could be something completely different in 3-4 years' time, and the training needs to be done to reskill those people. But if you panic about spending that money all in one go and putting everyone to the highest level possible, there is no natural career progression for them, or no way of them enhancing those skills throughout the business. So some planning needs to be done, not just about spending your money, but what are those skills gaps and what are the natural pathways of progression for those people through the business. I think when we start talking about the standards that exist, and again, that it's a framework or standard that exists, as has been mentioned, it's approved by the government currently. We will eventually have standards and all the frameworks will be retired, and frameworks are being retired as we go through now. But where we are at the moment in terms of the digital sector, we've got the infrastructure technician is live, we've got a network engineer, we've got data analytics, we've got one that's just been reissued with a funding ban in the technical sales, IT technical sales. We have a digital marketer available, software developer, and we've got the degree apprenticeship, which is the technology solutions professional, which has specialisms attached to it in the final year of the 3-year or 4-year program. So those are all live in our sector, and we've got employers currently engaged in those standards and are piloting them at the moment to make sure they're right for their organisations before they start investing the levy and larger numbers on those standards. Along with those, we've got some that are in development, and these are where, again, the employers have come to the groups and said, we need these, there's still a skills gap out there, there's no standard that fills these. So there's a business analyst that has been created and going through telecoms and unified communications. There's one that's being worked on. I can't say it will be the final occupation when it's put forward, but it's currently being put together as a digital customer service operative, which covers a multitude of roles within the organisation. And we're working, Ben and I are working with a group of employees at the minute on media planning and buying at level 3, 4 and 6 again. And on top of that, the first draft has been done now for the digital marketer degree apprenticeship at level 6. So those are all in development and will probably be ready by April next year. If they're not, it's knowing that they are, as we said earlier, coming along, and then planning for that and not panicking to put your money into something that may be not fit for purpose, waiting that to be live, and then investing for the right skills in the workplace. Now, having said all those, these are only the digital ones that we talk about, and in the IT sector, there are other standards that exist that might be more relevant to the roles. But if there isn't, and there's new standards that are required, by all means, contact myself or Ben. We can put you in touch with the employer groups. If it is needed, we can put an expression of interest in then, and that standard could be developed for you to meet those skills gaps within the organisations, because it has to be more than one employer, and there has to be a significant demand for that to be created. But we're happy to help any employers that want to do that.
John, just a quick question that I get from my members a lot, and that I think they would appreciate some clarity on is, what's the average time that it takes to create a standard, and what is the level of commitment? Because I understand that employers have to get together in a group to create this Trailblazer standard.
So it varies. I have to be honest. So putting together probably level 3, level 4s, which currently, I mean, there are some groups doing level 2s as well. And apologies for using levels. These are different occupations at different levels within it, but that's the way the government depict them. But whatever that occupation is, they tend to be, you can create those quite quickly. You need a minimum of 10 employers to support that, and you need those employers to invest in how many people they potentially are going to take in the first year. The difficulty is not writing the standard. The difficulty is linking it to the accreditation side that sits behind, whether it's with awarding organisations. They have to all be linked to a professional body, and in most cases with ours, they're linked to BCS, but with the digital marketer and others, they're linked to the Child Institute of Marketing, as an example. But it's that part that usually takes the longer part. It's not putting together the standard, and then the assessment plan, where we have to work out what that endpoint assessment is that the government wants, the synoptic side of it, and the final interview for the the grading. That's where a lot of the work is needed. How much time is involved putting together the standard? Usually, I mean, our employers are coming together probably 5 or 6 times as a group, in a working group, to put that together before it's submitted to BIS. And once the approval's done, then there's probably 2 or 3 more sessions working with those awarding organisations or assessment organisations to put the rest of it together, to make sure the quality is maintained and what they set out in the standard will be maintained in it. So usually we have 2 or 3 hour sessions for those working groups, putting the standard together, and then it's a wider consultation. So even if the employer doesn't want to be part of the working group, they can be part of the consultation to feed back into those standards, and still have their say on them.
And typically, I mean, well, 3 to 6 months is sort of the elapsed time. So it's not, when they were first begun, it's sort of for some of them, there are these sort of horror stories of it taking sort of 18 months. That's actually, I think a lot of it was teething trouble, right? And actually it's now a short.
Yeah, and I think, the horror stories that you refer to, some of the standards at the very beginning, when there were 8 employee groups, took 18 months, 2 years to bring to fruition. BIS now sits every month to review these. The panel sits every month so they can go through quicker. So the process has been speeded up along that. The degree apprenticeships take the longest because of the QAA process that has to go through the higher education institutions. So they take slightly longer. But again, there are organisations out there working with universities that are getting these through very, very quickly now because they've been used to doing the first one and they understand the process.
John, a question. Actually, we've been talking about developing new standards, but some employers might be thinking, well, actually, you mentioned quite a few of the existing standards or standards in development. That might do for me. What would your advice be when they're considering developing a completely new standard, or using an existing one and sort of bolting on their own insights, their own training?
I think, as we said, I think this comes back to the point we made earlier, that people need to know what the skills gaps are there and what their current training is and what does it fit into. I think the only thing, and I wouldn't say it's being nervous about it, but it's being very conscious of, is these frameworks will be retired at some point. We don't know. There's constant reviews. I think there's been 150 frameworks retired already. And we've just been told, as an example, that Digital Marketer was reviewed and being retired. So that framework now, it sits there. If a standard isn't developed to replace that, it can be contested that how can you retire something if there isn't a replacement. But if you're developing that program against the old framework that exists, it's really, really being tied in or clued into when that will go and if that training can continue. Now, if it is retired and you've started that program, they can complete that program. But there will be a transition then to whatever is needed for the new. And that might be the case that in the start, employers are very, very happy to use the old framework and bolt on, as you say, internal training that meets all their needs. But they might then be working as a group of employers to make sure there's something that comes round that they can use in future.
Just to be clear, because I should have said in my intro, but the difference between frameworks and standards, which is the government terminology. So in the old world, frameworks are kind of the approved apprenticeship programs that used to, and in some cases still do exist, that John mentions are being retired, and they're being overtaken by time by these much more employer-focused, employer-created standards.
The training are really the sort of the guide, but then the training provider will take that and elaborate that with insights. And can employers feed into that as well?
I would encourage all employers, as I said earlier, the employer should be leading this and dictating to the provider. They know what training needs are within their business. They shouldn't be dictated by us saying, this is the program we want to deliver because it's easier for us to deliver. This should be guided by the employer, and within our standards, the real work tasks that they have to produce for the summative portfolio at the end is real work. And we shouldn't be dictating to the employers and saying, this is what you need to do. They should naturally occur in work that takes place. and it should be through the guidance of the provider to say, this is your best work that you should be putting forward in that summative portfolio.
Do providers sit in during the Trailblazer standard meetings, employer meetings?
So in some employer groups,
Yeah.
not all,
Not all.
but in some cases they do.
And invited in, as it were.
Yeah,
invited in.
yeah.
So,
I
and
think it'd be helpful to understand the perspective of the provider and the employer to then best work together.
I think that's it's something, again, going back to the pace that the standards can now be created. At the very beginning, it was done in isolation through the employers. In the groups that we're working with now, and that's why we're on the groups, is we've been invited by the employers as a provider to be part of that. So have the awarding organisations, assessment organisations, the vendor providers are part of those groups. And sitting down and having one conversation, as opposed to the employers wanting something and then coming out and others going, well, that's not physically possible, it doesn't fit in that. They can have that conversation, they come out with a better product, but it's done in a quicker process.
Great. I'm conscious we cut into your slides.
No, well, I think it goes into the final point. Who can deliver these, and what's the most effective, coherent program that we can put together? Well, that's everything that we've been talking about. I think the big thing for me is not just the start point that the employers are involved in designing these, that they're involved in what goes on the program, and they also, in ours, say when the individual who's taking the apprenticeship is ready for that endpoint assessment. And if an employer doesn't sign off, as is called the employer reference, that person won't go forward to that point. So again, the provider doesn't go in and say that apprentice is ready, we're putting him for the end. If the employer says, well, they still can't do in this workplace, the employer doesn't sign that reference off and they continue their training till they're ready to do that as the end point. I think the biggest thing that we're being asked for at the moment from all the employers that we're talking about, and new standards, and even the ones we've started on the new standards, is how does the line manager understand what needs to be done, and who's the mentor, and how's that relationship within the organisation and the training provider maintained? And I think that's the biggest change, and even for people that have used the current frameworks and moving to the standards, the difference in how that works and how the evidence is collated, the endpoint, how you work together. We've been asked, and we've put together some training for those employers and mentors that will oversee what goes on in the workplace.
But I think one thing just to note on that, for people who aren't familiar with apprenticeships, who've not taken on apprentices before through the old world, I think that the apprenticeship standards are much closer to, I think, how you would naturally envisage an apprenticeship to be. The old world under frameworks was pretty artificial and constrained. It did what it said on the tin in terms of getting a young person or an existing employee kind of skilled up through a structured and assessed program. But I think if we think about the natural meaning of the kind of the unnatural understanding of apprentice, kind of learning from the people around them and demonstrating that they can deliver to a really high standard for that employer, and within that sector, I think is much closer to what people would naturally imagine.
But I think that you come back to the point, these standards are occupation based, and the frameworks, you had to put different units together to sometimes make a proper role. If this person isn't enrolled as a data analyst, they won't be able to meet those competencies within them. Now, data analytics fits into, I'll talk about finance again, but someone can do that standard as finance. This is a minimum standard, and the bolt-ons, the bits you talked about, they are minimum because they're generic enough to across all industries, sectors, different job roles that are involved in that. So there might be additionalities you've got to put on there, and that's where you need to work with the employer, that's where you need to understand it. But if that person isn't in a real job and capable of doing those things, they will never pass. So where people have had, I suppose, a negative thought process about apprenticeships, and they just brought in and said, this is an apprenticeship, someone should do this. This is a real job, and you can't get someone to pass this. They will fail if it isn't in a real job and meeting all that criteria.
What about could bring Doniya in on this, because it strikes me that the tech sector, the tech industry, is very much more focused on mentorship anyway, and the whole notion of almost like an informal apprenticeship is pretty fundamental to the way in which people learn, because technology is moving so quickly and the skills are having to be passed on. Have you found that your members are much more open to the concept of apprenticeship? They just get it more than other industries?
I think the tech sector is, like I said, really dynamic and has informal mentoring programs, and really they invest in skills in a number of ways, which may not be evident in a monetary process or in a graph, or the way the OECD describes it, primarily through the way, you know, learning on the job, etc. I think with the apprenticeship system, it is just a bit of a formalization of that process. But from my experience with speaking to our members and engaging with the industry, the questions and the concerns the tech sector has is mainly around the time-taking element, around the creation of a standard and making sure that that fits. But as John was saying, it's about pre-planning, understanding your skills gap, and working with your fellow employers and your providers to understand how you best meet those skills needs. So yeah, it's a really relevant question. I think it's just moving the tech sector along into thinking in that framework or standard.
Yes,
thank you. John, did you want to say?
I think that the final point for me is that these standards now, for the very first time, as I mentioned, are linked to professional bodies. So somebody coming out now with an apprenticeship in the tech sector is going straight, or can be registered, they don't have to, has the opportunity to be registered with the professional bodies. Now, the tech sector is a young sector compared to finance and other industries, but you know, for someone to come out, especially someone starting their career and come out and have an affiliation with a professional body and be recognised on the technical register, and even if they don't go on to do further apprenticeships, they can still have a career progression down a professional route, is fantastic. Likewise, for people who continue their career and they've been in work and they might retrain, might come back into work, they can step back on at that point and even register again with a professional organisation. But the training they do within that apprenticeship is recognised as the competency that you need when you go for those interviews, and you carry on that career progression again. And it's taken a long time to get affiliated with professional bodies to do that. And I think it's a blessing in disguise now that this is recognised in our sector. So that's the end of my
Great.
I'll pass back to Ben.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, and I just 2 points I sort of take away from that as you were sort of wrapping up. Then it feels like the off-the-shelf solution, as it were, the existing standards, they're a lot higher quality now. For everything you've just been saying, there's, apart from anything else, they've had time to be tested and a lot of employer engagement. So that one route is really high quality. But if that doesn't suit you as an employer, you've also then got the route of being able to create your own standard. So really, all employers looking at this now, wondering and feeling a bit tentative about what's going to happen in April 2017, need not feel that there's nothing for them because there's so many solutions.
I think so. I think the thing to be careful with about creating a new standard is the idea of the frameworks was to reduce the number of standards or apprenticeships that are out there. I mean, there are hundreds of these standards that are being produced at the moment, and there's probably more. They'll end up being more than there were frameworks in the end. And if you're going to, or you are interested in putting something forward as an expression of interest, it's worth just looking at what ones have been created. And on the BIS website, they're all listed. You can go on the BIS website and it will tell you which ones have been accepted to be developed. And therefore, you could just join one of those groups. It doesn't mean to say you have to set a new group up. You can be part of those. But if you are going to put something in, and it's not a 5-minute job to write an expression of interest, is to look across the standards that are or do exist to see where the overlap is with the role that you want. Because, as I said, it's a minimum standard. It might be that fits your requirement, but there's this add-on that needs to be done that you would add to it.
Great, thank you very much. Well, thanks, John. That was really good to get the insight, and thanks to all. Quite a bit of debate going. So just a quick reminder from me, we're going to go to the Q&A session and open this up to all of our participants now. So hopefully you've been listening to all of our panelists, and that's been provoking some great questions, maybe about how it's relevant to your particular area. So hopefully you've been scribbling those down. You'll see on the right-hand side of the screen now you should see the Q&A box has appeared, and that will allow you to put questions there. If not, it should be appearing in the next couple of seconds, just as we refresh. You've also got the opportunity to go onto Twitter, so please use the hashtag #ApprenticeLevy at Arch Apprentices. You can use the hashtag there to ask us questions as well. So please do let us know if you have any questions. I'm just going to quickly go on and have a look at what questions are coming in, so do bear with me a second whilst I go on and have a look. So we have a question coming in. The first question we have is, where does money go after the expiration date? So we talked before about the expiration. What happens to it?
So I'll tell you. So for the individual employer, it's the use it or lose it. If they lose it, it is going to go into a centralised pot, which the government will then use to either top up other employers who've overspent their levy. So if you underspend it, you can end up subsidising your competitors' training, or and still to be decided, it will be used to support the training costs for small and medium-sized employers whose payroll bill is below the levy, so who aren't paying the levy. We know they've done some modelling for how much they think could be lost in that way, but I think they are accepting that they're going to find out a lot about actually what the take-up is going to be like over the next, the first 12 to 18 months of the programme before they fully know. But I guess they like that incentive. They like the idea that people will be incentivised to use their apprenticeship levy for their apprenticeships, rather than the possibility that it'll leak to one of their competitors to train up their staff.
Yeah. I suppose that's the motivation, and that's the point behind it, isn't it?
Yeah.
And John, did you want to come in on that as well?
I think that, again, this we hope the document that's released tomorrow clarifies this in particular. It's the long-awaited part, what happens with the SMEs and the people that aren't necessarily affected from this levy bill. And I think what Ben just said should clear that up tomorrow if the document is as expected. So we should know more by tomorrow night if this document gets released.
Great, thank you. Donna, did you have anything to add from the perspective of that?
But I do have a question that's coming from one of our members previously, if you allow me. I know that we're expecting tomorrow in the guidance documents that to reveal whether or not you will be able to retrain a member of staff based on their current level of qualification. So, for instance, myself, if I've got a master's degree, would I be able to retrain on a level 3 data analyst apprentice under any circumstances, or is that unlikely?
What do we think, John?
I can only go on previous discussions, and you're right, we are expecting it to be addressed tomorrow. The previous thought process that's gone in is that if someone's got a level 6, 7 on a degree, then they should be doing the same level again, unless it can be fully justified that the role that they're doing now is completely different to what they've previously trained on. So if someone was doing data analytics and they're moving over to a completely new area, then could it be a level 3, I think level 4, not as a level 3. But again, that's what we're expecting to be addressed tomorrow.
Primarily because the tech sector, we have a lot of challenges recruiting the right talent, and there's a lot of individuals who'd like to reskill into the tech sector. And there's a lot of those individuals, such as women returners after maternity leave, Army veterans, who may be presented with an opportunity to reskill into the tech sector. However, if those women returners have bachelor's degrees in a subject like English or history or anything like that, it would be greatly beneficial to the government's listening if they could reskill into tech at any level, because
we're completely expecting the government to be pretty pragmatic about this. I mean, what they want to I guess prevent is someone who's got a degree in, we'll keep going back to data analytics, it's on our mind obviously, a degree in say data then going on to an apprenticeship. So they've got a degree, that's level 6 in, we're trying to get equivalent levels, going on to an apprenticeship at level 3 as a way just to kind of top up their training and a way for the employer to use up their apprenticeship levy. Otherwise, they definitely want it to be for people who are acquiring new skills that they need to be able to deliver a new and different job role. So, you know, that example we gave is very extreme over at one side. I think for the rest of it, there might be shades of grey, but generally speaking, we're expecting the government to be pragmatic about that.
I think for me, if there's something as diverse as you're talking about, to come back in and do something in the tech sector, it makes total sense that it is new. And I think if someone has done a computer science degree and then they want to do networking at level 4, what was covered in that degree and why aren't they just topping those skills up, if you like? So I think it's being able to really justify that there is a change in the job role that we do.
Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you for putting those questions in. Keep the questions coming. We've got a good flow of questions coming in now. Just going to go back to Ben. I know you've pulled together some of the most frequently asked questions.
A lot, and some of the responses, I won't necessarily go through all of them because we're circulating the slides afterwards. But this is one where your finance directors may well be asking you, what is the basis for the apprenticeship levy calculation? And here is the answer. It's all earnings. So it includes bonuses, it includes commissions, pension contributions, so on and so forth. And it's the total amount of earnings subject to Class 1 secondary NICs. So that's what it's based on, not benefits in kind, but everything else. So it is the true cost of your payroll is included. So I hope that. And
will that be including contractors and anybody associated to your payroll?
Yeah, anyone on payroll. Yeah.
Not exactly. Permanent staff. It could be third-party contractors.
If they're on the PAYE, then absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. Quite a lot of we've discovered quite a lot of misunderstanding about this. The government talks a lot about this £15,000 allowance. And people have, we've had people tell us very varied, wildly varying interpretations of what that means. You know, is it that we get £15,000 per apprentice? Is it that we only have £15,000 to spend on the levy? Actually, the allowance it's the best way to think about it is like your personal tax allowance. So it's the bit that you aren't taxed on, or the bit that you aren't levied on. So if 0.5% of 3 million is £15,000. So you're not levied on the first £3 million of your payroll. It's only anything above £3 million that you are levied on. But the structure, the mechanism that HMRC will use is an allowance so anything. So the two ways of kind of working it out. One is you can work out what 0.5% of your payroll is and then take off £15,000. Or you can take your payroll, take £3 million off, and then work out what 0.5% of that figure is. So I hope that makes clear what the government means by an allowance.
Will that mean that if your levy contribution is X number per month, will the £15,000 be divided by 12 and removed? Because that's the number one question we
That's
get. What
we understand will happen is that for it will be £1,250 will be. So let's say your levy is £10,000 a month on your whole payroll. £1,250 will be deducted from that. Will be automatically removed. So
and it will go straight into your
£8,750 will then go into your levy pot. And actually, what government is talking about, again to be confirmed, is that certainly for the first year they would top that. After your allowance, they'd top up by 10%. So another £875 would go into your levy pot.
And the £15,000 allowance and 10% top up is only for the first year. Is that right? Which will then would be reviewed.
The £15,000 allowance is likely to stay.
Yeah.
But it's obviously an adjustable allowance, so they can flex that if they want to, if they feel that firms who 3 million is the wrong cut-off, it should be 4 million or it should be 2 million. They can they can flex that. The 10% feels much more like a discretionary thing to oil the wheels of the change and the transition.
Great. Makes sense.
Lots of people saying, isn't it just a tax? And actually, it is. And I think government officials are actually quite happy to talk about it as a tax. But we have heard one or two interpret that as, so I don't get any of that. It all disappears into some central pot, never for me to see again. And I hope we've made clear that, yes, it's compulsory, and HMRC will be, making sure that employers do pay, but you can see it again. You can absolutely see it again in the form of training provision for either existing or new staff going through apprenticeships. Another thing that we get asked, particularly for companies who are just above the levy bill, so someone who's got a levy of, say, £30,000 a year, may have in the past been used to taking on 5 apprentices a year. Well, 5 apprentices a year at £20,000, for example, is considerably more than their £30,000. So what happens to the £70,000 that is the new gap between what they're paying in their levy and what they have been used to doing? And the government certainly wants to encourage that. So again, very kind of tentative, this one, but there's been some of the kind of smoke signals look like, again, certainly initially, government will be very generous on meeting that gap. So not covering it all, but covering perhaps up to 90% of that amount. So once you've got through your levy, it feels like there might be some really generous support for you to go above and beyond, which I think will be really exciting. And then the final one, we've sort of alluded to this, or we've talked about it. We have been told on good authority, not just by journalists, but by journalists as well, that there will be an announcement tomorrow, which will answer some of these questions and maybe others as well. And I know Doniya is ready kind of to type out the briefing for members of techUK.
Yeah.
We're also going to be doing a briefing as well. So we'll of course let you know those details. We'll try and provide a digest to our respective constituents, as it were, tomorrow as soon as that's done. As always with things that are political, we think it's going to come tomorrow. We hope it's going to come tomorrow.
Yeah. Great. And did you want to take us through how we can find out a little bit more about Arch in the next steps? Or? Yes,
I mean, we're coming up to time, aren't we? Just want to, for those of you who are interested, Arch, I gave a quick introduction to us. We've been around 4 years. We're an Ofsted outstanding training provider, and we have got a bunch of apprenticeships that we can deliver for you today, as it were. Those are on the left-hand side of this slide, and as John has talked about, we're also in the process of developing our own capability to deliver a bunch of other apprenticeship standards, which may be of interest as well. So if I hope what we've talked about has been useful to people in its own right.
Yeah.
But if people did want to carry on a conversation, I know Doniya is available for techUK members, but we'd obviously be very happy to talk to people about this further.
And that's obviously what Arch does. Beyond just providing the apprenticeships, they also have now the ability to provide consultancy to make the most of the levy.
We can certainly advise on help people to plan for that. Yeah.
Fantastic. Okay, then let's just go to some questions now. I'm conscious we've got probably another sort of 5 minutes or so. The question came in, they recently saw an SFA representative speaking at Gloucester Uni, I think, mentioning that accredited training courses could be recouped from the levy as well as apprenticeships. Is that likely, do you think? Maybe start with John.
I think if the accredited training is listed as part of the standard, the answer to that would definitely be yes. If you were to, so in particular, I suppose if someone was doing one of the standards that we're talking about, so I'll talk about the infrastructure technician, there is a range of professional certificates within that, that if they were going to go down the route of maybe using those vendor certificates, they are already mapped in and are equivalent of the knowledge modules that are there. So some of the standards will. Certainly in our sector, there is a lot of those certificates that are mapped into the standards, but I don't know in all sectors. So I know in the finance they've tried to put their AAT, etc., all mapped in, and other sectors, but not every sector will have done that.
Thanks. Ben, anything to add on that?
No, I think that well, just to say the government is very keen for this to be as popular as possible, and certainly sometimes these things are kind of, they paint a very rosy view of what's going to be possible or not. But certainly the idea is that if it's training that's valuable to the business and that helps the business to skill up its workforce for these new roles, then they want that to be in principle part of this.
Thanks. One last question I think we've probably got time for. What do you think about businesses training their own assessors to A, recoup some of the apprenticeship levy back into the business, and B, whether the assessing and delivery of apprenticeships in-house would improve the engagement?
I think it's a really good point in that there are particular skills and specialisms and infrastructure in some of the companies that no training provider will be experienced on. And how is that captured and how is that training done or assessed? For us to go into one of those companies, we certainly, again, as we said earlier, we wouldn't go in there and say we know more about it than they do, or that we should be doing that training. It's going to be a mixture of working with those employers to do it. Do they need to be trained as assessors at that point, or just work with the current provider is a different question. And I think that there's also a part where companies are asking us how they can engage the older population of the workforce who may be leaving the workforce, and possibly keeping them on 2 days a month to support this training. How can they be skilled to do that? And I think where those skills exist in the workplace, they should be utilised as much as possible, because they are the experienced people. How it works in combination, I think, is very much down to the provider and the employer.
So absolutely, and certainly one of the things we're talking to a lot of people about, Tim, is to for us almost as the approved training provider. And if people are asked, if the question is kind of, should we set ourselves up as a training provider, that's a real toughie, because you have to be on the government register. You're liable to an Ofsted inspection, which is extremely stressful and doesn't always go the way you want. Ours did, but it's not by no means guaranteed. It's a lot of work in terms of audit and setup and so on and so forth. But if people have got experts in the organisation who can really help the process, as it were, we can with the money that's paid to us, we can almost buy back in that as a service from the employer. So to that extent, it's helping them to recoup, able them to keep on training skills within their organisation and divert apprenticeship levy funds towards those people. So there are ways of doing it.
Yeah, great. Well, I think we're out of time now. That's been really great to get so many different perspectives. Maybe just a closing word from each of you. Doniya, I wonder whether I could start with you, maybe sort of an industry perspective from techUK and from you on what you've heard today, and any thoughts ahead of tomorrow's announcement.
Well, we're really looking forward to kind of hearing more about what's coming out. Like I said in the very beginning, it's a bit of a watch this space at the moment. And like I said at the beginning, where techUK is acting as a critical friend to government and ensuring that the levy is fit for purpose in the future, and that the levy works in such a way that we can address the digital skills challenge of the future. Currently, tech sector employees are a bit concerned that the number of apprenticeships won't necessarily meet their skills needs, but I hope that after viewing this webinar and getting to have a chat with myself or with John or Ben, they'll have a better understanding of what standards are out there, how it will address their skills needs, and where are there gaps, and where can those gaps be filled with the levy.
Great. Thank you. And John, closing thought.
I think for me, it's not being scared of the change that's taking place. I think there's a very good opportunity now to use these new standards for the training in the organisations, and for people to look at what their current training is and what the standards exist and how they can best map that in. Not to panic that there isn't a standard. These are minimum standards, and where possible, that training will probably fit one of those generic standards that has been written. and that will take a lot of the workload away rather than worrying about creating something bespoke and writing it for themselves.
Thank you. Ben?
I was going to say what Tom was going to say. probably with less articulation. So, no, that's.
Oh, great. Okay, well, even with that, I think you've got the main points across there. But I think you're right. The key thing that I'm taking away from this is that it is an incredible opportunity. The government have been talking about apprenticeships, but they're really now acting to make it a reality. And it's an opportunity for businesses like the companies who are watching today to really sort of seize that opportunity. There's still a lot who aren't, but they've still got time. So I think, part of the announcement tomorrow will hopefully get it more on people's radars as well. So I hope you found today's webinar useful in helping you understand how the Apprenticeship Levy will affect your business. And you've taken away some ideas about how you can start preparing for it today. If you'd like to know more about Arch and the services they provide, then you can go to archapprentices.co.uk or call 020 8080 9553. We'll be sending out a link to the webinar. Please feel free to share that, both with your colleagues in your own organisations, but also wider than that. As we were saying before, we're really keen that as many companies as possible are aware of the changes that are coming so they can start preparing as well. So finally, I'd like to thank our panel. I'd like to thank Doniya, Ben and John for sharing your knowledge, experience, and also a big thank you to you, our audience, for taking the time to join us today and for all of your questions. So thank you very much and good afternoon.